All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us, the Project Censored Radio Show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Kamau Franklin, who is the founder of Community Movement Builders, Inc., and has been a dedicated community organizer for over 30 years, beginning in New York City and now based in Atlanta. For 18 of those years, Kamau was a leading member of a national grassroots organization dedicated to the ideas of self-determination and the teachings of Malcolm X. Kamau has coordinated and led community cop watch programs, liberation and freedom schools for youth, electoral and policy campaigns, large-scale community gardens, organizing collectives, and alternatives to incarceration programs. Kamau was also an attorney for 10 years in New York with his own practice in criminal, civil rights, and transactional law. Kamau, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So I want to just dive right into the thick of things here and let the breadcrumbs fall where they may. Because there is a lot of talk about fighting racism, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, fascism, and of course, rightly so, these forces must be fought. And at the same time, there is far less talk, I feel, about building the future that we want to see, the futures that we deserve. There's a lot of arguing amongst ourselves about which ism would be the best to use as a foundation after capitalism, while not as often doing the work of building those alternatives. And as someone who has spent so much time building those alternatives, I'd like to start off here with first asking you, how should we approach this split, this constant push and pull of building versus fighting?
I think we should see a build and fight strategy as something that goes together, as opposed to something that we need to actually have splits and fights about. Because I think you don't really get, in my estimation, the masses of people involved unless they can see what exactly it is that you're talking about. Well, somewhat what you're talking about when it comes to another alternative besides capitalism. So what is the so-called new economy? What does socialism look like in practice? What is it that we can do to develop alternatives to capitalism so that people can see communal ways of working together and organizing together, flatter line structures, our ability to build things that can help support folks and move people forward, while at the same time being truly honest and saying, whatever these model projects are, if they become to a level where they threaten capitalism and you're not challenging it, capitalism was going to attack them anyway. Capitalism is going to cut off, even if you're building out cooperatives, capitalism will cut off access to resources, access to supply chains and the rest of it, just to show and prove that there is no other model besides capitalism. Capitalism will come after your so-called leaders or workers and have charges brought up against them or bring things up about them just so they can prove or show that anything outside of capitalism does not work, that any alternative ideas are those of the edges and should not be listened to, and that the only thing that we can do is further participate in this system. So we have to understand that build and fight is a real thing. It's not build or fight, that those things go together, and part of those discussions that we're having are really discussions that delay our efforts at moving forward and organizing together, and we need to put those to the side and really get some work done.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's kind of a similar juxtaposition was the idea of autonomy within a capitalist framework, something that community movement builders refers to as the liberated zones theory. And indeed, that's something that we've seen at play, whether that's the Zapatistas or in Rojava, the idea of creating liberated space within an entirely oppressive global capitalist framework. But how does that work in your mind when we talk about larger issues such as police brutality, universal health care, colonialism, imperialism, or climate change?
I think the same thing applies as in, as long as we're not confusing the fact that you're trying to build spaces that we have some self-determination over or some control over, like confusing those spaces for the ultimate objectives, then I think those spaces are good to create. On a much larger level, you mentioned the Zapatistas. Look at Cuba, Nicaragua, the Soviet Union of the past. In some ways, those could be considered, loosely put, liberated territory, right? And some of those places had vast resources at hand. Obviously, they had governmental structures, they had infrastructure, but still, because the capitalist orbit is so vast and so strong, that capitalism was able to, in some ways, and in some cases, defeat some of those places and or isolate them. So as long as we understand that even creating autonomous zones or liberated territory are part of a larger thinking about how we fight back against capitalism, because we need to create spaces where people can somewhat feel safe to organize, can do some organizing, can have access to resources, can conduct things like mutual aid, we can have cop watches. We have to be able to show people our ability to be transformative in our actions and work. Otherwise, they're just not going to pay us any attention. Otherwise, it's just rhetoric form. And as we're doing that, at least in my estimation, we're also building the potential people power to, again, go after state capitalism, to fight back, whether or not that's through demonstrations, whether or not that's through rallies, whether or not that's through more direct action oriented approaches. Those are the things that we have to build towards. And having places and or organizations that are big enough to help fight back is what we have to create. We can't settle on thinking that just because we, i.e., protest the state, that the state is going to fall beneath us, right? The state is equally able to subdue protest and or larger militant action at this particular stage as it is anything. And so as we, again, we're fighting this state, we have to think about what gives us some level of support now for everyday people to feel like they can see what the future holds if they partake, if they see something that they're getting out of it, they see different structures that they can participate in, and start to have some control over their lives and some power over their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious too, within that same vein, the role of political education, because there's this feeling that like, okay, we have to build as we're fighting, but there's, and I'm sure you've seen this much more than I have, but the people falling into these systems of oppression because they have not researched or looked into alternatives, and so you end up going into the old capitalist programming. So could you talk about like the role of political education while also making it accessible, so that you're not like walking into a community space and being like, here are a bunch of books everyone has to read before we get started?
I think political education is completely undervalued in terms of the work that we do, because it's, and again, there are people who have been politicized who have failed us. There are people who've been politicized who have at times informed on us or become part of the state, right, apparatus. However, without the basis of political education, you have no possibilities of challenging the state. Because what happens, again, even when we talk about things like cooperatives, if there's not a political education aspect to it, then people just start to see it as a money-making enterprise. Or if you talk about the role of direct action and demonstrations, and people sometimes will be in electoral politics, if you're going to use these tactics, then you have to understand their limitations and how they further movement, as opposed to how they may divert movement or take away from it. And only through the idea of studying not only the capitalist history of what's taken place, but the alternatives and the other movement organizations and revolutionary movements that have happened before us here within the United States, of course, and around the world, how those movements have been international, how those movements in some cases have been Pan-Africanist, how those movements in some cases obviously have been anti-imperialist, how they've been some of them directly socialist and or communist, even anarchist movements in the sense of building flatline structures and having autonomous ways of acting and diversity of tactics. All of those things matter today in terms of fighting back, particularly Western capitalism and American capitalism, which is undergoing some changes as we speak. And the question is, will we, as sort of the alternative to what's happening in capitalism, be able in some ways to take advantage of that and to build while that's happening? Or will we continue to fall victims of it and be used by those systems to continue to use us as sort of outsiders to our community as they continue to come down on us, and then divert our community back into the capitalist orbit and or the mainstream sort of propaganda establishment orbit? Only through political education will we begin to learn and see the tactics and strategies of the capitalists, how they're used against us, what we have to do to avoid those tricks of the trade, what we have to do to stay unified, and understand that under no circumstances can we give in to the capitalist hegemony, because if we do, then we will be falling 5 or 10 paces back once again, and again, falling back into a space where we feel like we're always rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding, as opposed to building off on top of something else that was already done and learning from those mistakes and doing it better next time.
Yeah, and I know that CMBP has been, and also since you live in Atlanta, has been involved with the Stop Cop City project, and I want to discuss a little bit about that as well, because you were talking about how like the tactics of the state, and I'm curious, do you feel like things are ramping up? Is this just kind of a repetition of what we saw with the Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, or do you feel that as U.S. hegemony is kind of flailing, the empire is falling very destructively and slowly, but do you think that this is a new frontier that we're experiencing here, or this is kind of a repetition of what we've seen in the past?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's built off of the past. I think some of the strategies of past of demonizing organizers and activists, of demonizing people, particularly who use militant tactics, of calling people outsiders when they come to do work from other places. I think all of those are strategies and tactics of the past of using overwhelming police force. But I do think they're being designed and implemented in different ways. And i.e. in Atlanta, one of the ways that we're trying to counter, which wasn't the case during the 60s COINTELPRO, is actually for Atlanta, which considers itself a Black Mecca, is having Black establishment, petite bourgeois, middle class politicians and business people who actually are the front folks for building Cop City, and how that creates the class dynamic within the community that we must confront. And so some of those aspects are new. But the tricks of the trade of protecting the American empire and protecting capitalism over the demands and needs of the people, that's as old as the beginning of the United States itself. So that's something that we have to see is something that's going to be here, that something is going to impact us, and we have to see about making sure that we fight back against those strategies and tactics by implementing not only things, again, that we've learned from the past, but also learning new ways in which we fight back against that. This may not be the form necessarily where this discussion will happen in, let's say, in a long form way. But within the Black community, the idea of the class confrontation is something that needs to be dealt with, particularly by organizers and activists and people who consider themselves radicals. Because when we rely on the representation politics that have been here for the last 30 years, and we think that that's progress, every time that happens, we fall backwards, backwards, backwards. And so we have to think through those things, through that struggle, and move forward with a politic that tells us when someone is tied to like an Obama figure, tied to the capitalist empire and keeping that empire going, then those folks have to be called out for who they are, and it doesn't make a difference what they look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you speaking about that reminded me of this was years ago, obviously, because he's dead now. But I remember John Lewis came out outside the Capitol building. There was a Black Lives Matter protest that had marched all the way through DC and made it to the Capitol building and had gone through barricades that they had set up at the Capitol building. And there were, like 4 or 5 Capitol police, and that's it. And people were just walking up to the doors. And then John Lewis came out as if sent out, and started speaking. And there were a lot of arguments that were happening amongst the crowd there. And of course, as a white person, I was not stepping into this conversation, but the conversation was that, like, let's keep walking or let's step back. And ultimately people stepped back. And I just kept thinking, like, oh man, we could have kept going into the Capitol, and what would that have looked like? I mean, I'm sure it wouldn't have been pretty in a lot of ways, but what would have happened? And I'm curious your thoughts here, like how, I mean, these conversations seem to be happening a lot. And I'm curious, first of all, how you feel about these conversations, and also how you feel that folks who are not Black can either participate, or how we should best support the more radical strategies here.
I mean, I think these conversations, in terms of participating, some of them are happening, but some of them just don't happen to the level of there's a respect for elders, right? And sometimes rightfully so. But sometimes, as you mentioned, the idea of having elder spokespeople actually is done to dilute the militancy of a struggle. And so when people refer to a John Lewis as opposed to a Kwame Ture, i.e. Stokely Carmichael, then you can see which side of the dividing line they're trying to set up, right? When people refer to a Martin Luther King, let's say of the 1963 genre, as opposed to 1967 and 1968, you can see what kind of the dividing line that they're on. When they refer to Malcolm and they take out the politics of Malcolm and try to talk about Malcolm strictly after leaving the nation, but without talking about his anti-imperialist politics, which followed him and which developed after the nation, without talking about his revolutionary nationalism stance, but trying to fit him into the idea of a civil rights leader, then again, you can see that. And you can see that happening over and over again with different political leaders and how folks are either looked at and or how they're ignored. Assata Shakur is ignored in terms of larger history of movement politics. But there are other more civil rightsy people, let's say a Kamala Harris of today, which is lifted up to us as somebody that we should emulate or who represents some political progress for us as a people. And so we have to understand that there are dividing lines. And like the conversation before, the question before, it's only through political education and reading and understanding that history that you begin to see when someone is putting forth folks who they tell you who are your heroes, when really they're meant to stop your movement from taking a militant stance. They're meant to stop your movement from having an analysis of capitalism. They're meant to stop your movement from having an analysis of imperialism. And so those things we must confront and talk about. And I think there's a place for everybody, obviously, in certain discussions. And when we speak about folks other than Black folks, there are communities to organize. There are people to work with. There are collaborations to be made between all of our communities. This is an effort that affects all of us, right? And there may be different approaches or places that we all may need to be, but we have to be in communication. We have to strategize together. We have to be comrades. We have to figure out how we work together, because otherwise, again, our movements get separated. Otherwise, all of us do things which are that we may think may be the smart thing to say, but until you check with an ally on, hey, I wanted to say something like this about a leader in the Black community. How should I say that? And somebody might be able just to help you out with the wording or framing, or to make sure you don't say something idiotic that you hope that you think you're saying is going to be radical or revolutionary, but it's not going to come off like that if you say that. So I think we need to continually, when we're in community, support that community and help support each other. Particularly, again, if we're all claiming to have these left politics at this stage, it's hard for me to see why we need to have discussions on the difference between Trotsky and Lenin as being far more important than the discussions around how do we, with the overlapping of politics that we have, how do we fight together to fight back against capitalism and imperialism?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of like I touched upon earlier, this arguing about which ism is going to be the best. It's kind of like we're arguing about what to do after capitalism falls, before capitalism falls. And it's like, guys, we have a lot of work to do. And this armchair arguing of your ism versus that ism, and it causes so much splintering, right? It's like, you've got socialists saying, I refuse to work with anarchists, and anarchists saying, I refuse to work with socialists. And a lot of that, I feel, has a lot to do with the programming and the misunderstanding of those terms as well, which feeds back into the conversation about political education. And when you say the word socialist, as well, particularly anarchist, the ideas that flow in people's heads are probably not at all what you mean.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that can also be
I would say, probably over the last 15 years, maybe even longer than that, of my work with folks who identified as anarchists. And that includes anarchists who've been former Black Panther Party members, to black box anarchists, to some of the most strategic organizers I know who are anarchists, who have more resources than we have. And I'm always like, my running joke is like, you're supposed to be an anarchist, you're not supposed to be that well organized. But I think people do a disservice to, even if they don't consider themselves, as I don't, like I'm not considering myself an anarchist, although I think I have some anarchist tendencies. People do a disservice in not either understanding or appreciating the type of work that anarchist formations do today, that again, other formations, whether they're socialist or communist, but they're on the left, do not engage in, to their detriment, to be honest. So I think there's a lot of things that can be learned from anarchist structures, work habits, abilities to sort of have these flatline structures and to understand diversity of tactics, but to be engaged in work beyond, and I'm not saying anarchists do this exclusively by any means, but to be engaged in work beyond strictly having these discussions and debates around who is the best sort of hero of our past generations and stuff like that. Again, I'm not saying they exclusively do it the best, but at least in my knowledge or my work habits, I've always noticed this over the last 15 to 20 years, a particular astuteness and numbers around anarchists who are willing to throw down and do certain kinds of work. Again, I do believe in certain types of structures and governance that maybe more so than some anarchists do, but I'm always appreciative of the work, the way in which folks work, and the way in which folks have been accomplishing things over the last few years. So.
Well, it's always nice to hear somebody who appreciates the nuances as much as I do. um, so and kind of with that, I wanted to dig a little bit back into community movement builders because of the fantastic work that y'all do. And everything from community gardens to safety patrols and cop watch. And I can't remember where I read it, if it was in Revolutionary Suicide or another book, but talking about what really made the Black Panthers threatening was not that they were walking around with guns, even though that's what the popular white supremacist ideologies would have us believe. It's that they were teaching folks and they were gardening and they were feeding people, and that was really dangerous. And so I'm curious, could you talk a little bit more about CMB, and also how you kind of maneuver the lashing out from the system that we've seen in the past as well as today?
Well, I mean, I a couple of things on that is, a nonprofity word is place-based organizing, right? Which means being in the community. And I think one of the things that folks forget about the Panthers that you just brought up is that they were part of that community. SNCC was part of the community. When SNCC did grassroots organizing, they lived in the homes of people they were organizing with. It developed freedom schools, right, in partnership with people in the community. The Panthers developed liberation schools in partnership with people in the community. And so when we look back at sort of our historical precedents in terms of who we thought was doing good work and why these organizations were destroyed, right? They didn't just fall apart. They didn't just melt away. They didn't just have one bad fight and that was the end of them, right? These organizations were systematically went after by the federal government, with the point group being the Federal Bureau of Investigation, because of their effectiveness in potentially moving Black people on the ground, right? And that's what we take from that. And that's what we learn, is that you have to be in community. So our office is not downtown, someplace away from the neighborhood. Our community house is in the community that we want to most organize with during this time period. And like you said, it's everything from mutual aid, what we call our liberation program, to developing cooperatives, to having a stability fund so we can help people stay in their homes, to doing the safety walks, the cop watches, to doing the community gardening. All of that is impacted by the fact that we're there in the community, and we do it with the mix of political education, because without any of that, we will surely fail and position ourselves potentially as some church group, which we always have to make sure that they don't think we are. Because the first people are so conditioned, the first word out their mouth is, "What church y'all belong to?" It's like, no, 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 we're not a church. I mean, we preach at the helm of the revolutionary spirit, but that's as churchy as we get. So we think that only comes through, obviously, again, the political education that we all try to go through, that we all do with each other, and that we do with the community. And like you said, you mentioned before, like political education takes many different forms. It's everything from books, it's everything from videos, it's everything from having collective conversations. It's art, it's culture, it's all of that stuff mixed in here. And different people are reached by different things, right? So some people, we've had conversations in the community where we directly say, what is capitalism? What is socialism? And there'll be other days where we might do something and it's more like, why don't we have food that is developed or grown here in this community? Why is this place considered a food desert? Let's walk through all of that. And so you never know what grabs people, what's going to make people sort of decide that they can now figure out, or they've, in some ways there already is a tinge there. Like for most people who are poor and oppressed, they understand it. They may not always have the language for it as someone who's read a lot might have, but they understand it. For them, it's the big thing is around what's going to, where should I put my time? Is there anything that makes me want to put my time into working against this, as opposed to just relaxing, or as opposed to having to work 2 or 3 jobs, or as opposed to taking care of my kids, or as opposed to just hanging out and having some fun, because I need that time, because I know tomorrow I got to work a 10-hour shift, right? So we have to put ourselves in a position to be like, another way to spend your time is fighting back against the very oppression that leaves us so tired, drained, and feeling that we can't participate and control our own lives. And how do we do that? How do we make that fun sometimes? How do we make it interesting? How do we make it feel like it's something that's going to get resources to you so that you see the need and the desire to participate in it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the making it fun, as my sister from another Mr. Emma Goldman put it, I don't want a revolution where I can't dance.
Yes, exactly. We believe in dancing. Yes, we.
Kamau, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down. Where can folks learn more about what you do and connect with you?
The best place is communitymovementbuilders.org. They can find out about all of our work, how they can get involved with our work. We're on all the different social media platforms as Community Movement Builders. And then they can find out about different events, things coming up. We do have a conference, a Black Organizing Conference coming up in late June, and they can go to the website and find out about that. We also have a affiliate group for Community Movement Builders for folks who are not Black. If they wanted to join and help and support our work, they can go and find out about that. So go to the website. There's an info@communitymovementbuilders.org email address, and they can write us there to also get more interaction and find out how to get involved.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate being with you.